Hi, this is Tim of the 1916 Company with another luxury watch comparison. Haute horlogerie, integrated bracelet, stainless steel sports watches versus starts now. All right, a familiar matchup, or at least the pieces should be familiar. Nautilus versus Alpine Eagle, Patek Philippe versus Chopard. Now, I realize there may be some objections because there is a newer core Nautilus Jumbo, which is the 5811. I have featured the 5711 1A-014 because this is a steel watch, and I believe you have to compare steel to steel. You may also argue that there is a higher volume Alpine Eagle with a date that might be more directly comparable to this watch, at least in that regard. But that model is not, in my opinion, of sufficient refinement and sophistication to compare directly to a Patek Philippe. So this is the matchup that I feel is most equivalent and shows the strengths of the respective watches relative to each other in a way that is relevant to collectors. So let's zoom out a little bit, and we'll start with the watch that is unarguably the more familiar of the two, the Nautilus. Now, of course, the 5711 came out in 2006. It was discontinued after 2021. This green dial model was a one-year edition. It is the Dash 014, and it did feature a new movement, the 26330. So let's talk about the watch dimensionally. In steel, you can see 40 millimeters in diameter. It's 8.6 millimeters thick. From lug tip to lug tip, just the case, it's 44.5 millimeters. Then end link to end link across the wrist, this is going to be 48.4 millimeters. Throwing it on the wrist, I will tell you, it does feel a little bit lighter and more compact. Also a little bit more delicate, but in the sense that it's more sophisticated, that the pieces are more refined. It doesn't have a bulk to it on the wrist. So the bracelet is very supple. It has smaller individual links than the Chopard, and the links are individually thinner too. So there is a lovely refined delicacy to how this wears. Now my wrist is 16 centimeters, so get a good look. I believe you could wear this watch on a wrist as small as 14 centimeters. Taking a look at the case here, now this is an original. Some might argue that the Chopard is based on the 1980 Saint Moritz, and it is. The Saint Moritz is an old-timer and certainly a classic in the Chopard catalog. The problem is, even then, it was a response to the work done by Gerald Genta in the 70s, including the 1976 Nautilus. So this is the original in that regard. And in terms of case construction, it seems like it's just a little bit more sophisticated, nuanced, and complex than the Chopard. And I'll show you exactly what I mean here. Now, there's handsome faceting, but the actual assembly is fairly conventional, whereas you can see here the bezel features double finish satin adjacent to polish on an integral component. And the bezel actually overlaps the edge of the case, locks down to create the water resistance, whereas here you have a much more conventional case, and though it is nuanced in its finish, I don't believe it is quite as refined. I will mention, though, the Chopard is incrementally thinner, 8.3 versus 8.6. Now, the watch is equipped with a bracelet that has removable links fixed by pins and sleeves. This is a setup not everyone likes. Patek went to it because you can't strip out a pin sleeve system. You need a block and punch to size it, but unlike a flathead, you can't strip the screw and leave a link stranded. So that's the idea right here. They're not trying to be cheap, they're just trying to create a idiot-proof bracelet, if you will. It's a nice little ceramic pin snap in here that adds some refinement. As the double fold closes, you can see that the clamshell locks down on that ceramic pin snap there, so if in time you're worried about the tolerance becoming ropey or indistinct, the steel cannot wear down the ceramic pin snaps. This will always be snappy. You will see here that the bracelet is a bit less sophisticated than the Chopard, and we'll get to that when we read off advantages and disadvantages. On the dial side, the green dial was a one-year only for 2021, and unlike some of the other 5711 models, it's not a gradient, it's a consistent shade from the inside to the outside. We have white gold hands and indices, as well as date frame on the dial, and of course, this being the caliber 26 330 SC, we do have hacking seconds as well as a quick set date. Now, everything in the Patek catalog has been re-rated to 30 meters, but let's be honest, with a screw-down crown and an original rating of 120 meters, this is a much more water-resistant watch than, say, a snapback Calatrava. Taking a quick look at the movement, you can see this is the 26 330. The most obvious way to tell the difference is the reduction wheel adjacent to the rotor itself. If that little wheel has engine turning on it or perlage, it's the old 324 or 315. When you see this design, you know that it's the 26 330. Of course, it's also on the bridges, so you will see it's labeled. There's a little bit of adhesive back here from a piece of tape. Don't worry about that. The movement's 27 millimeters in diameter, 3.3 millimeters thick, 45-hour power reserve, 4 hertz beat rate, free sprung with a Gyromax style balance, at least a 3rd series Spiromax anti-magnetic, concentrically breathing and thermally inert silicone hairspring. You can see it's beating away at 28,800 vibrations per hour. It's adjusted in 6 positions, which is 1 more than a standard chronometer. And it has that Gyromax style architecture where all the adjustment is done using variable inertia screws on the balance rim. All this pivots on 30 joules. It is quite good looking. Now, how does the watch look in the dark? Let's take a quick look. I actually find, and I'll show you a little bit later, but I believe that when you put these two together, it's hard to discern on camera which one has better lume. But I'm going to give you the opportunity to see this side by side before I call a winner at the end of the comparison. That's how it looks on screen. It looks very different in person. So, what are you going to pay for one of these? Well, forget the original retail. They're long gone. Right now, these go for between $240,000 and $250,000, though some ever optimistic asks have been as high as $300,000. Trust me, unless it has a Tiffany signature on the dial, it's going to be about $250,000 US. All right. Now, jumping over to the Alpine Eagle. The Alpine Eagle came out in 2019. There was a lot of cynicism surrounding it initially. People thought it was very much a Me Too type watch, but as we got hands-on experience, we realized the watch has a lot of character that's all its own. A lot of that tied up in the quality of the bracelet and the movements and the dials that set this apart from, say, a Nautilus or a Royal Oak. Now, the original St. Moritz was launched in 1980. It was the first watch overseen from a design standpoint by Carl Friedrich Schäufele, who today is, of course, the chieftain at Chopard. His family has owned the company since the 1960s. This is a more sophisticated version of the Alpine Eagle. This came out in 2023, and the XPS 41 is 41 millimeters in diameter, but it gets slimmer thanks to a micro rotor automatic. It's 8.3 millimeters thick, and the watch is 46 millimeters from lug tip to lug tip. And we'll do a quick measurement just so you can tell how this measures from end link to end link. It's going to be a little bigger, and I want to demonstrate why that is the case. So it's 52 and change, as you can see right there. So it's a bigger watch on the wrist, even though on paper it seems very similar in size to the Nautilus. So we'll put it on my wrist, which again is 16 centimeters, and take a quick look. By the way, lucent steel used. So the steel used on the Patek is going to be somewhere between 155 and 180 Vickers, whereas this is going to be about 223. So it's a little bit harder. In terms of scratch resistance, the Chopard has a narrow edge in that regard. Now, this is a bigger watch. It may not look it, but I can tell you on the wrist, it feels more massive. The bracelet is massively made, and while that is superb for the sake of durability and overall quality, it also results in a watch that feels bulkier. It is heavier. It's reassuring. It's definitely a luxurious kind of heft, but it doesn't have the lace-like delicacy of the Patek when it is on the wrist. There's your over the top, there's your cuff shot, and then here's your down the barrel. Okay. So let's talk about this bracelet. The first thing you'll notice is, unlike Patek, which is making its own bracelets right here, we have a watch that includes some parts that are farmed out, but I'm going to say that in terms of overall quality, the bracelet of the Alpine Eagle is better. Take a look at the inside here. That implies every single link can be removed to precisely size this. And you can see all those links are fixed by center screws. Taking another look, you can see that each link features a little bit of a countersink. So there are the primary links, and then there are these intermediate links that are countersunk, so they slot together, and the result is a bracelet that has some of the slightest side-to-side play I've ever encountered. I don't know if you can see this on camera, but there's a lot more movement in the Nautilus bracelet, and there's no penalty to be paid for that with the Chopard. It's not unpleasantly stiff or uncomfortable in any way. It just has an incredible physical integrity to it. You can see the links are thicker. Getting down to the clasp, I think a trigger release system in this day and age is something you really need, and that is in fact why the newer Nautilus models use that type of arrangement. So the clamshell on the Patek puts it a little bit behind the curve, and the bracelet is also made of lucent steel here. So you're going to find that it is marginally more scratch resistant than its Patek Philippe equivalent. There's also no real penalty in terms of the finishing sophistication. It seems just as intricate as on the Patek Philippe, with facets and dips and swells, polish and satin, and several different planes, including this unique spline or spine raised down the center. Taking a look at the case, it is not quite as sophisticated in its assembly as the Patek, and maybe not even as elegant in appearance, though it is a little bit thinner by 0.3 of a millimeter. And you can see that the faceting is quite dramatic, sophisticated, and complex. So real time was spent here. It's just the case itself isn't quite as sophisticated. The watch, of course, featuring a movement of extraordinary quality based on the original Michel Parmigiani designed caliber 96 from 1996. It is a micro rotor automatic with twin barrels, a 65-hour power reserve, both Geneva hallmark finish, which, by the way, goes for the watch as a whole, and a COSC certified Swiss chronometer. It's got a 4 Hz beat rate, an overcoil hairspring, pivots on 29 joules. It's an excellent timekeeper. It is incredibly beautiful, and you can see there's no obstruction of your view of the movement by a winding bridge or a center rotor, so big advantages on that front. Now, a quick note. This watch is still available new for $24,300. Used, you're going to pay about $18,500 to $19,500, which is good value. So, in terms of advantages, we may as well start reading off the advantages. This watch right here has hardened steel, and on something so intricately finished, a little bit more scratch resistance is to be applauded. The dial, too, is more sophisticated in its design, its finish, and its execution. Both of these dials are brass blanks with white gold hands and indices. Initially, this was described as a gold base by Chopard, which is why many, including myself, described it as a solid gold dial. It is not. It is brass, but you can see the depth and the texturing and the pattern. It's original and it's dramatic, and the effect is breathtaking. Whereas here, it's competent. This is truly opulent. I'm also, on the basis of a superior dial aesthetic, hardened steel for case and bracelet, going to shout out that the quality continues inside. The standard Alpine Eagle has a Louis Ulysse Chopard manufacture movement, but it is not autologerie. This is, in my opinion, a more interesting movement. Now, the only thing it lacks that the Patek has is hacking seconds, but this movement has a better and more beautiful case-back view. It has a longer power reserve by far, by 20 hours. It has the combination of Geneva hallmark and chronometer certification, which is extraordinary in combination. Even though the accuracy and the finish are not necessarily better than the Patek, it's ambitious to go for both certifications. I like a metal overcoil hairspring. It's more traditional. It's something that needs to be manipulated and maintained by hand over time, unlike the silicon, which basically is broken or not broken. But again, this is a repairable hairspring, whereas the silicon and the Patek will need to be replaced. Is that a problem in 10, 20 years? No. Is it a problem in 100 years? Maybe, theoretically. I like this movement better, if only because the micro rotor makes it easier to view and appreciate, and its architecture, the size, proportion, and relative positioning of the parts is just a lot more attractive. There's a lot of nondescript bridge here and also a lot of obscured view. So on that basis, advantage Chopard. Obviously, the value equation is here. The bracelet offers more sizing options. It has that incredible solidity. It has a twin trigger release system. It has this remarkable countersunk assembly with no gaps, no daylight showing between the links. The watch also has no date, which some people will argue is an advantage as it creates a more balanced dial. I'll leave that up to you. Oddly enough, these movements, though it may look like the movement in the Chopard is larger, the Chopard movement is 27.4 millimeters in diameter, whereas the Patek is 27. Both are 3.3 millimeters thick, so this micro rotor doesn't make the movement thinner, just more beautiful. And let's take a look at the Patek now, because it has a lot to recommend it as well. I'm going to just say, although you may believe they were equally loomed when I showed you the loom shot, to my eye, the Patek is much brighter. and it's obvious here in the studio. So, advantage on that front. Also, monumental investment. I can imagine this holding its value over time. I can imagine this becoming an absolute legend. If you buy it for $250,000, it'll never be worth less, and it's almost certainly going to be worth a lot more. So if you want to own one to wear and also sort of point towards a future when maybe you're going to give it as an heirloom or sell it, this is a watch that is going to be worth that kind of long-term emotional and financial investment. Also, evergreen style, and I don't just mean the green dial here. This is a watch that was one of the originals. The originals are generally described as the Rolex 5100 in 1970, the Royal Oak in 1972, and the Ingenieur SL from IWC, and the Patek Nautilus of 76, and the 77 Vacheron 222. That Chopard was part of an early 80s class of watches that emulated those originals. So this, to me, this is the original. This is something that has the investment of being on the forefront. So that is important to me. It was important in the 1970s and 80s when this was an original and the St. Moritz was sort of the knockoff. And it's true today when this is the original and this is sort of gloaming onto the sports watch craze the last few years. I'm also going to say that the date for me is an advantage. I like it. I like the feature. I miss it when it's gone. I'll let you decide. Now, it's true that this watch doesn't have Geneva hallmark, but it has the Patek Philippe seal. And it doesn't have a chronometer certification, but Patek promised this watch would run no worse than -3 + 2 seconds a day when it came out, and that's better than COSC chronometer. So don't be put off by the fact that this isn't Geneva hallmark or chronometer certified. It may actually surpass the standards of both, and that by some margin. There's also an anti-magnetic hairspring here that gives the watch a level of sports watch resilience and durability that the Chopard does not have. And the hacking second. This has hacking seconds. This was the only brief period from 2019 to 2021 when Patek put a hacking seconds movement in the Nautilus. 2019 to 2021. Before that, it was the 324. 324 never hacked. This was made at the tail end of that run in 21, and it does have hacking. So I'm going to mention that because although people have protested in my review of the XPS 41 that this is a hacking movement, I can assure you it is not. So here we go. Notice that I am setting the watch and that the seconds hand is running. This is not a hacking movement. Can I offer some back pressure and maybe stall the hand? I can at a low state of wind, or if I apply enough back pressure, but that's not really the same thing as hacking. I could stall the hand, but that's not a precise setting methodology because you can't really control where it stops or when it resumes. So this is not a hacking watch, and I think that's important to emphasize. So which one of these do I prefer? I'm going to say that given the monumental and undeniable price advantage of the Chopard, as well as the architecture and the open display case back vista of the micro rotor Chopard, this would be my choice. Now, if the price were equal, it would be a much closer comparison, where I would start to think about things like this watch's longevity as an evergreen style, the presence of a date, the greater fine finish of the case and its more complex assembly, the fact that I know this will never go out of style, this will always be desirable, the fact that this is money in the bank, but the problem is this just costs so darn much. So if you're in the market for these today, this is like an alternative to a supercar or some real estate. This is just a really handy high-end watch that goes the distance, even against Holy Trinity, even against Lange. So reach out, let me know in the description, or I should say the comments below, which of these you would prefer, cost an object and cost no object.